Thank you. I want to thank Senator Cardin for his kind words and for his introduction here today to you. He has indeed been a partner in many of these issues that face us, so much so that in the hallways of the Senate, when I'm approached by the press and they ask me, can you comment on the bill you're doing with Senator Cardin? I start getting, which one? We've worked on so many of these issues that are so critically important, and it truly is an honor to work with him on these. And at the outset, I excuse myself. I've already told Vladimir, I think Senator Cardin has the same issue. We, in addition to a 10 o'clock vote in the Senate, have two important hearings going on at the same time on two committees I'm a member of. One is the Foreign Relations Committee, which Senator Cardin is the ranking member on the general topic of America's engagement in the world. And then the Senate Intelligence Committee has public hearings today on a topic that, well, I think you know what it's on. And so we'll need to get there on time. But I also want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this event, the state of human rights in Putin's Russia. And I don't quarrel with the title. I understand the point. But it's not Putin's Russia. It's Russians' Russia. Vladimir Putin happens to have control of the government there today. But Russia's not Vladimir Putin. Russia is a ancient, proud culture and tradition embedded in its people. Vladimir Putin just happens to be a tyrant that today controls its government. But I thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. And I also, of course, am incredibly proud to be here with Vladimir Kara-Murza, who you all know well, and I'm going to have a chance to, and the honor to introduce him shortly. When we talk about people around the world who risk their lives in the name of freedom, Vladimir is an example of just how true this is. And his brave fight for democracy and freedom in his country is truly an inspiration. We have an award in America called the Profiles in Courage, and it's largely given to someone who took political risk, because you might have lost an election, or you took on some nasty criticism in the press for doing something. And I understand, relatively speaking, that is courage in the American political system. Real courage is, incredible level of courage is knowing that your position on politics could have you killed, exiled, or both, and poisoned not once but twice. So I'm honored to be here with him today. The state of human rights under Vladimir Putin in Russia has, of course, long been on a severe decline. This deterioration has only accelerated in recent years as Putin and his cronies have cracked down on civil society, the media, anyone critical of the Russian government. When times are tough in Russia, as they of course are now, this happens, and this is what happens there. An abysmal human rights situation that becomes even worse. We have seen over the last number of years Vladimir Putin's critics mysteriously poisoned, many occasions, on multiple occasions, thrown out of windows, murdered. All this just this year alone, and we're only in March. Vladimir Kara-Murza recently survived, of course, his second apparent poisoning attempt. The government has implemented draconian laws attempting to bar public dissent. Just this weekend, we watched as thousands of predominantly very young Russians took to the streets to protest corruption within the Putin government, to make clear that the people of Russia, what they want is a transparent government that respects their voices in shaping their future. So what was the response of the Putin government? They arrested and detained hundreds of people. This is only the latest incident that reminds us of how critical it is that the United States stands with the Russian people in their fight against a brutal, corrupt, and repressive regime. This behavior by the Putin regime is nothing new. In 2015, Russian authorities began implementing a 2012 law that places any advocacy group that accepts foreign funding on a list as foreign agents. Many non-governmental organizations either spent resources defending themselves against these attacks and labels of being a foreign agent, or they simply closed. Each year, he tightens his grip on the country as he tries to mask the abuses against his own people with aggression outside of Russia. Globally, Putin has made clear his intention on the world stage. He wants to establish spheres of influence in Europe and now the Middle East. And what that has meant is him aligning with the most brutal tyrants and regimes in the world to undermine not just America's, but the peaceful nations of the world's interests, and in the process to perpetuate war crimes. He's actively working to drive a wedge between Western allies and within Western institutions such as NATO and the European Union. He directly interferes in nations looking to further align themselves with democratic values and with the United States. We should be under no false illusions. Putin's dreams of restoring what he sees as the days of the Russian Empire are what drives him in these goals. And it's an important thing to remind us that Russia, as I said, is a nation and a people that should be very, very proud of its history, should be very optimistic about its future given the chance, and has so much to contribute to the world. It does not need a tyrant in order to achieve these things. We all have read and have heard and will continue to hear in the weeks and months to come about Putin's efforts to meddle in the elections of our democratic allies in Europe, just as he attempted to influence our own elections here in the United States last year. In the Middle East, he's engaged in a bloody military campaign in Syria, partnering with Iran and with the Assad regime. He claims to be fighting ISIS, but it's clear that their efforts have deliberately targeted civilians. They've blocked the provision of food and medicine, as well as efforts by the United Nations to end the suffering of the Syrian people. He's worked with Assad and has inflicted thousands of civilian deaths and injuries and contributed to the refugee crisis, as even more refugees flee the ever-increasing instability. All this chaos makes it, of course, easier for the world to overlook the ongoing abuses of the Putin regime against his own people. But we cannot allow that. And that's why it's important for us to have gathered here today to renew our commitment to the cause of human rights in Russia and to remind people like Vladimir and others, other brave democracy activists, that we truly do stand with them, that we will use every tool at our disposal to hold Putin accountable, and that we will not allow the brave acts of people like Boris Nemtsov and others to have been in vain. The most brutal reality of the human rights situation in Russia is that critics of the Putin regime end up being targeted, or worse, as I said earlier, they die. Last month was the 2-year anniversary of the assassination of Mr. Nemtsov. He was murdered on a bridge in Moscow in plain sight of the Kremlin. That was 2 years ago. No one's been held to account. We must continue to call for justice and honor these brave individuals in Russia who stand up to Putin and his cronies. That's why on the anniversary of his assassination, I introduced a bill to rename the street in front of the Russian embassy Boris Nemtsov Plaza. If you go to my Twitter account this morning, you will see that we've taken the liberty to use Photoshop or some other app, I'm sure it's Photoshop, but to actually show you what it's going to look like on the day that we achieve that. Some may ask, what impact is this going to have? Well, as Vladimir eloquently put in the Washington Post recently, it will remind Putin's regime that they are on the wrong side of history. And I believe it will stand as a symbol to the Russian people that these dissidents' voices live on and that defenders of liberty will not be silenced. As Vladimir told me a few moments ago, the current regime in Russia will be angry about the naming of that street. But hopefully a future democratic government in Russia will be proud that the street in front of their embassy bears the name Boris Nemtsov. As the new administration now continues to shape its foreign policy and its national security strategy, I truly believe it's critical for them to include human rights and democracy as core elements of any broader engagement with any country in the world. And Russia is a perfect example of why this is true. I'm proud to have joined Senator Cardin in introducing comprehensive sanctions on Putin that will target the regime's cyber attacks, aggression, destabilizing activities in the United States and against our allies. Additionally, the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act is one valuable and critical tool that the United States has to address human rights abuses by Vladimir Putin. We also need to continue adding individuals to this list and holding those complicit in human rights abuses directly accountable. We should also consider new measures to target the state-sanctioned corruption at the top of the Putin government, the corruption that brought thousands of Russians out into the streets this past weekend. These young Russians realize that their country has a huge opportunity to join the rest of the world, to embrace democratic values and the respect for the rule of law, and to protect the human rights of all their citizens. Sadly, Russia's current leader has chosen a path of aggression and instability. His actions in the region, in his own country, pose a national security threat to the United States and undermine our interests and the interests of all freedom-loving people abroad. As long as he continues to choose to go down this path, we must choose to strengthen the relationship with our allies in the region and with the Russian people, and to support them as they confront these aggressions. Our country, the United States of America, must stand with the Russian people in their fight for freedom. Now it is truly my honor to introduce Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is here with us today. after surviving an apparent attempt to poison him last month. The second time, as I said earlier, in recent years that this has happened. He has made Russia's future and the cause of promoting civil society and democracy in Russia the work of his life. And despite being a target, he continues that work undeterred and as passionate as ever. Vladimir, you are an inspiring example to all of us here in the United States, and I believe to the Russian people, to people everywhere. And it's my honor to introduce you to those who are present here today and those who may be watching from home. Ladies and gentlemen, Vladimir Karamurza.